translating three Hebrew constructions that specify Yom, day. My notes from a discourse workshop held in Cameroon in 1997 record that Dr. Joseph Mfonyam, a native speaker of Bafut, was concerned because the Bafut team had translated when Jesus had entered Capernaum with a relative clause, the time that Jesus entered Capernaum. Throughout this presentation, square brackets enclose the constructions I am discussing. Joseph felt that the relative clause gave too much prominence to the time and proposed that a shorter construction should be used instead. At least three different constructions in the Hebrew Old Testament are used to specify time words such as day, days, or time. The problem for translators into other languages is that English versions often render all three of them with a relative clause. Here is an example of each of the constructions when the head noun phrase they are specifying is b'yom, on the day, with translations from the RSV. First, an infinitive construct, typically translated with of, as in Genesis 2:17b, on the day of your eating from it, which the RSV translates in the day that you eat of it. Secondly, a relative clause introduced with the marker asher, as in Deuteronomy 4:10a. On the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, with the marker asher, translated the same way in the RSV. And thirdly, a relative clause with no relative marker, what seminarians call an asyndetic relative clause, as in Deuteronomy 4:15b. On the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire, without a relative marker, but the RSV adds that. In all three examples, the RSV uses a relative clause introduced with that to translate the construction that specifies on the day. Relative clauses in Bafut give prominence to the time. This paper argues that the only construction in Hebrew that gives prominence to the time is, conveniently, the one with the relative marker. So the Bafut team should probably use a shorter expression when translating the other two constructions. Hyman found that the size of different constructions is significant. In particular, the length of an utterance may correspond to the extent to which it conveys new or unfamiliar information. Reduced form may thus be an economically motivated index of familiarity. If we compare the size of the three Hebrew constructions we are considering, infinitives construct are the most reduced, the shortest, while asyndetic relative clauses are reduced when compared with relative clauses introduced with asher. And remember that Joseph Mfonyam proposed that the Bafut team use a shorter construction than the one with a relative clause to avoid the time expression being too prominent. Hyman wrote that reduced form may be an economically motivated index of familiarity. And we shall see in section 1 that most instances of day with an infinitive construct specify times that are familiar to the readers because they have been mentioned or implied in the immediate context. In contrast, we shall see in section 2 that instances of day with relative clauses introduced with asher often specify a time that has not been mentioned in the immediate context. What is important for translation purposes, though, is that relative clauses with asher tend to give prominence to the time that they specify, unlike infinitives construct. B'yom, on the day, sometimes functions as a complex preposition, often translated when. There is no time in this presentation to discuss passages in which such may be the case, though the question is important for translation and is discussed in the full paper. Instead, Section 3 will concentrate on the significance of specifying beyond with an asyndetic relative clause rather than an infinitive construct. The paper ends with some implications of this study for translation. So firstly, yom with infinitives construct in the Pentateuch. On at least 30 of the 40 occasions when infinitives construct specify yom in the Pentateuch, the time that they specify will be familiar to the readers because of a reference in the context. In 25 of the passages, the previous reference is found in the immediate context. In Exodus 40, verse 37, for example, 37a had referred to the cloud not being taken up, and the infinitive construct in 37b relates back in a contrastive way to this reference. In other passages, the infinitive construct specifies the next time in a schema, or what Chafe calls a cluster of interrelated expectations. In Genesis 25, 22 to 24, for example, because Rebekah is pregnant, her days of giving birth is a natural next step in the schema of childbearing. I suggested above that because infinitives construct are the most reduced way of specifying times, they may be thought of as a non-prominent form of reference. This explains why they sometimes specify a time that has not previously been mentioned or anticipated in the immediate context. For example, Genesis 40:20a informs us that the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, literally the day of being born Pharaoh. This information is given solely to explain why Pharaoh made a feast for all his servants. What is important in the passage is what happened to the two servants who had met Joseph while they were in prison together. Now we consider 2 of the 6 passages in the Pentateuch in which the infinitive construct specifies beyond. In each one, the reference to which the infinitive construct relates is found at an earlier point in the book. Consider Genesis 5:1, for example. This is the book of the generations of Adam. On the day of God creating man, he made him in the likeness of God. Prior to Genesis 5:1b, there had been no reference since 1:27 to God creating man in his own likeness. However, that assertion would be accessible to anyone who had read the book to that point. The infinitive construct appears to have been used because it is a non-prominent way of specifying a time at the beginning of a new section of the book. In other passages again, the infinitive construct is found in a reference to time that occurs at the end of a passage. For example, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus end with the following summary. This is the law of the burnt offering, of the cereal offering, of the sin offering, of the guilt offering, of the consecration, and of the peace offerings, which the Lord commanded Moses on Mount Sinai on the day of him commanding the people of Israel to bring their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. Once again, the infinitive construct has probably been chosen because it is a non-prominent way of referring back to the time frame for the instructions of chapters 1 to 7. Further motivation for using a short way of specifying a time is that it occurs within a relative clause introduced with asher. In summary, then, when an infinitive construct specifies yom, the time to which it refers will usually be familiar to the readers because it has already been mentioned or anticipated in the context. Even when such is not the case, the time that the infinitive construct specifies is not given any prominence. This conclusion implies for Bafut that infinitives construct that specify yom should not be translated with a relative clause. A shorter expression would be better. Secondly, yom with relative clauses introduced with asher in the Pentateuch. Hyman's iconicity principle predicts that because relative clauses introduced with asher are longer than infinitives construct, they will be more likely to convey new or unfamiliar information and be more prominent. An examination of the 15 occasions in the Pentateuch when a relative clause with asher specifies yom reveals that it is indeed the case that in at least 9 of them, the time to which they refer is new to the context, exemplified in the next slide. In 3 or 4 others, the temporal expression has probably been placed before the verb for focal prominence. In the remaining 2 passages, the temporal expression is sentence final and, again, focal. The following are 2 of the 9 passages in which a relative clause with asher conveys new or unfamiliar information. Firstly, Numbers 14:34. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days for every day a year, you shall bear your iniquity. There is no previous reference in this reported speech to the number of the days in which you spied out the land. And Deuteronomy 4:10a, on the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, the Lord said to me. The last reference to the Lord speaking to the people at Horeb was in 1:9, and the message he gave there was different. In 3 or 4 passages, a temporal expression that includes a relative clause with asher has been placed before the main verb of the sentence in Hebrew for prominence, focal prominence. Consider Leviticus 13:46, for example. He shall remain unclean all the days which he has the disease. As the RSV puts it, he shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. 3 of the English versions I examined end the sentence with the temporal expression, thereby implying that it is indeed focal. 3 others begin the sentence with the temporal expression, and to show that it is focal, it has to carry primary stress, bolded in the example, when read aloud. For example, as long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. With they remain unclean, known information. Now consider Leviticus 14:46, in which the relative clause that specifies all the days is asyndetic. Moreover, he who enters the house all the days he has shut it up shall be unclean until the evening. The temporal expression precedes the verb, but it is not focal. Rather, it is part of the topic about which the comment is made. He who enters the house all the days he has shut it up, topic, shall be unclean until the evening. Furthermore, the temporal expression does not convey new or unfamiliar information. Rather, it relates back to verse 38. Then the priest shall shut up the house 7 days. So we might have expected an infinitive construct to be used. In section 3, we will note that when an asyndetic relative clause is used instead of an infinitive construct, this is sometimes associated with a significant change of topic. The same could be true here, since the previous verses all describe what the priest is to do to a house that is affected with some disease. Now there is a change of topic. In a couple of passages, a temporal expression that includes a relative clause with asher is placed at the end of a sentence, which potentially allows it to be a focal constituent. One of the examples is in Deuteronomy 1:46. The RSV has been modified to reflect the Hebrew original. So you remained at Kadesh many days, like the days that you remained. Mays states that many days like the days that you remained is a Hebrew idiom. which is a means of affirming the previous statement when that statement is vague and indefinite. In other words, the idiom employs a relative clause with asher to give some degree of focal prominence to it. Note the word affirming. I conclude that when relative clauses with asher specify yom in the Pentateuch, the time which they specify is either new to the context or else is focally prominent. This conclusion implies that it is likely to be appropriate to use a relative clause in Bafut and many other African languages to translate relative clauses with asher that specify yom. I now consider the significance of using an asyndetic relative clause to specify b'yom, on the day, rather than an infinitive construct. First, consider Leviticus 7:35 to 36, which has both. 35 is asyndetic. This is the portion of Aaron and his sons from the offerings made by fire to the Lord, consecrated to them on the day he, Moses, presented them to serve as priests of the Lord. 36, construct, which the Lord commanded to be given to them by the people of Israel on the day of him, Moses, anointing them. 735 uses an asyndetic relative clause to specify b'yom, and no reference had previously been made in Leviticus to the day Aaron and his sons were presented to serve as priests of the Lord. Indeed, the ordination of Aaron and his sons is the NIV title for the next chapter. In contrast, 736 uses an infinitive construct to specify b'yom, and Leviticus 6:20 had already referred to the offering that Aaron and his sons shall offer to the Lord on the day of his anointing. 736 repeats that reference with the pronoun now in the plural in the infinitive construct. The following statements summarize the use of these two constructions in Leviticus 7:35 to 36. An asyndetic relative clause was used to specify b'yom when no reference in the context had been made to the time concerned, and infinitive construct was used to specify b'yom when the time which is specified was already familiar to the readers because of a reference in the context. Now consider Deuteronomy 4:15 to 16, which has an asyndetic relative clause in 15b. Therefore, take good heed to yourselves, since you saw no form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you act corruptly by making a graven image for yourselves in the form of any figure. The time specified in 15b is familiar to Moses' audience, since he had stated in verse 12, "Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form." So why did he use an asyndetic relative clause to specify the time rather than an infinitive construct? Good News Bible, NIV, and NLT all insert a title at verse 15 to indicate a change of topic to that of idolatry. The use of an asyndetic relative clause in 15b might therefore suggest that Moses is more interested in his audience concentrating on the new topic than on relating the time concerned to the one that was stated in verse 12. So asyndetic relative clauses appear to have been used to specify b'yom in the Pentateuch, not only when no reference in the context had been made to the specified time, but also when the change of topic is particularly significant. In such situations, the author is effectively saying, the discontinuity with the context is sufficiently great that I am restating the time rather than asking you to relate it to an earlier reference in the context. Conclusions. This presentation has distinguished the functions of three Hebrew constructions that specify yom in the Pentateuch: infinitives construct, relative clauses with the marker asher, and relative clauses without a relative marker. When an infinitive construct specifies yom, the time to which it refers is familiar. It has usually been mentioned or anticipated in the context. Even when such is not the case, the time that the infinitive construct specifies is not prominent. When a relative clause with asher specifies yom, the time which it specifies is either new to the context or else is focally prominent. When a relative clause without a marker specifies b'yom, on the day, the time which it specifies is usually new to the context, like relative clauses with asher that specify yom. When the time specified has been mentioned in the context, the discontinuity involving a change of topic is more significant than the link with the context made by the earlier reference to the time. Implications for translation. I began this presentation by noting that Joseph Mfonyam was concerned that the Bafut team had translated when Jesus had entered Capernaum with a relative clause. Joseph felt that the relative clause gave too much prominence to the temporal expression and proposed that a different and shorter construction be used instead, the equivalent of an adverbial clause of time. Adverbial clauses of time in Bafut consisting of a finite clause in the immediate past tense, followed by the backgrounding particle a. Relative clauses give prominence to their referent in many African languages. See the references in Levinsohn 2023 in the final slide. So it is likely that Joseph's observation about foot will apply to those languages too. European languages have the option of translating some infinitives construct with a non-finite verb. For example, in Genesis 25:24, the Good News Bible has the time came for her to give birth, translating were completing her days of giving birth. And Numbers 6:13 in the Nueva Versión Internacional in Spanish has an infinitival expression, al cumplir su periodo de consagración, on completing his period of consecration, translating on the day of completing the days of his consecration. Other languages will also have more than one way of translating temporal expressions in which one or other of the three constructions we have been considering specifies yom or b'yom. The challenge for translators and consultants is to ensure that the construction they choose conveys a similar degree of prominence or discontinuity to that of each expression in Hebrew. Thank you.